Okay.
Okay.
Now?
I'm so sorry. All that time I thought I was talking and you were listening. The mic was not yet turned on, so now it is.
Okay.
Thank you for your patience.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be here and kickstart the seminar series for this term. Thank you, Susan, for the introduction. Sorry, Joanne, you didn't get to hear it, or anybody else who's online right now. I want to apologize that I can see that I presume that there's going to be some differences between the slides that I prepared and what I can see right now. I think because of the online interface, things may have been a little readjusted. So if anything gets covered up while I'm talking, I'm going to try to address that. Like Susan said, I am a PhD candidate in the speech language pathology department, and my specialty is in investigating linguistic and memory decline in patients with dementia. So this is what I'm going to be talking about today. And I just want to say if there are any questions while I'm introducing the subject, and if anybody's not a specialist, I would prefer that you ask the questions so that you follow the remaining of the presentation rather than just being lost and not understanding anything that I'm saying. So please, by all means, if you have any questions while I'm talking, particularly in this beginning of the section, just let me know. Okay, so one thing that I can see is that I had some animated slides that are not going to be animated for the purpose of this presentation. So I'm going to try to deal with that as I go. So to begin with, I want us to all understand what discourse is. So discourse is an extended stretch of language, and that can be a stretch of language of any kind. So if you're having a conversation with someone, that's considered discourse production. If, like I am right now, you're giving a lecture, this is also a type of discourse. Or if you're telling a story, that's also considered discourse production. And autobiographical memory is defined as the memory that we have of our personal past experiences. I hope you guys can start to notice how the two can be related. So clearly, if you want to tell somebody a story about something that happened to you, you have to access these two types of cognitive functions, one of them being the memory and the other one being your ability to put these memories into language. In order to produce discourse, we need to do a little bit more than just producing basic language. So a discourse or a narrative or a conversation, they're not just strings of sentences or words placed together. There's a higher level of organization that a person needs to have in mind when they're producing an extended stretch of language like that. So for example, you have to maintain a topic of discourse. So you have to make sure that all the information that you are providing is related to the theme that you aimed to talk about. You also have to organize and integrate facts and concepts. You have to have a plan leading to a communicative goal. So why are you doing this? What's the message that you're trying to get across? While doing that, you have to make sure that you're producing well-formed sentences. You have to retrieve lexical information or words, and you have to be aware of the listener's perspective. So where do my listeners come from? What information they already have? How can I be informative? How can I make sure that the person I'm talking to is interested and is understanding everything that I'm saying? So that's to begin with. When we talk about analysis of discourse, we can look at it from two different perspectives, therefore. You can look at discourse production from a microlinguistic perspective. So you have micro, like the name says, like you look at the small things. So can the speaker remember all the words that they are trying to say? Do they have any phonological impediments, right? So anything that is a small, lower level linguistic production is included in this microlinguistic analysis, and this is related to language-specific features of our cognition. So, for example, the ability to produce words and sentences. When we talk about macrolinguistic abilities, we are talking about this more general needs that discourse production requires, such as being able to organize the information coherently, such as being able to make inferences, and have chronological organization of the story you're telling, right? So this is known to be related to other cognitive functions, such as attention and memory, so that you can remember what you've already said, so that you can know what you're going to say next, for example. Okay, so needless to say that while we're doing that, our brain is very busy. In order to produce language, and I'm not going to extend too much into the brain parts, but I think it's important that we understand just how busy our cognition is when we're trying to produce discourse. So we produce language in a very summarized manner through two areas in the brain. One of them is in the inferior frontal lobe in purple, which is called Broca's area, and is the area that is responsible for speech production. And in our posterior temporal lobe, which you see in orange on the screen, there's an area called Wernicke's area, and that's the area that is responsible for speech comprehension. And in between these two areas, we have tons of white matter tracts that connect the two, and that's how we are able to listen to conversation and be able to respond immediately. When we talk about autobiographical recall, you guys already know that that's the type of memory that refers to the knowledge about the events that you experienced yourself. What you may not know is that it relies in two subtypes of memories. The first one called episodic memory, and that's the memory that we have about events at a specific time and place. So if you have been married, you may remember your wedding day, you remember who the guests were, you remember kind of cake you had, you remember what your clothes look like. So this is all information that is stored in your episodic memory system. Semantic memory, however, relates to the general knowledge that we have about the world and ourselves. So what color of dress do brides usually wear in the Western society, at least? What color? White. Right. So this is not something that you remember because you saw just once, right? Like this is stored information that is general, that is not attached to a specific time and place, but it is nevertheless information that you have in your memory. So that's your semantic memory. So the message that I'm trying to get across here is that in order for a person to be able to recall and retell narratives about their own lives, they need both preserved memory and preserved language. There is a reciprocal relationship, including memory and language, and particularly for these kinds of tasks. And even in studies with child development, it has been found that language and memory are very much related. In studies done with children, they have found that autobiography and discourse abilities develop together. So at the same time that a child becomes able to retell narratives about their lives, they're also able to store longer stretches of experiences. And depending on the vocabulary that a child has at any given time, that will also relate with their ability to be able to recall details from that event. So if they had an experience with a dog and they are already able to say dog, leash, ball, and all of this information that may be related to the event, they will be able to recall it better in the future. So episodic memory in the brain is a very complicated network of distributed around the brain, but it's very widely accepted that this region that you see in green in the lower level of the cortex is very highly relevant for accessing and storing episodic memory. So that's the hippocampus, and this area in the inner part of our brain is called the medial temporal lobe. And that's one part of the brain that is known that if it's degraded, if you have an accident or if you have amnesia, this is the area of your brain that will be impacted. The semantic memory axis is not quite very well defined. There's some controversy in the literature. Most scientists agree that we have a variety of areas that are involved in semantic memory process, particularly because we need different sensory and motor areas of our brain to store information in order to create a unified concept. So if you hear a dog, you know it's a dog. If you see a dog, you know it's a dog. If you smell a dog, you know it's a dog, right? So these are all these kinds of informations are always stored in different parts of your brain. But some scientists believe that the part that you see in orange in the bottom of the brain, that's the anterior temporal lobe. It is believed to act as a sort of a hub. So it collects information from all the different areas of the brain and puts it together to create a unified concept. So what I'm trying to get to is that telling a narrative about your personal life is not a trivial task. It involves several parts of your brain. Everything needs to be working properly for you to be able to recall and report these memories. So one way that we can think about it is we can think that memory is a storage system in which you keep this information that only you know. You are the only person who has lived through these experiences from the perspective that you have. And the only way that you have to inform someone of these informations that you have been through is through transmitting this information via language. And we're going to remember that we have episodic memory, which is related to these specific details about an event. We have semantic memory, which gives this sort of background of the general knowledge that you know. We have microlinguistic features, for example, the ability to retrieve specific words. And we have macrolinguistic features, which are related to being able to organize information in a coherent manner. Do you have any questions so far? No? Okay. So hopefully that was clear. And so now we have to think about what happens when a person develops dementia. The first symptom that a person may have, often has, and that makes them look for a doctor is that they start not being able to name things or name people even that are closely related to them. And the first thing that a person suffering that will think is that they have a memory problem. But that's not necessarily true. They may have a linguistic problem, and they're just not aware of that. So this is one very important question that we have. And in types of dementia, language or memory can be affected differently. So what we did is we are currently developing 3 studies in order to understand better this relationship between language and memory. The first study that I'm going to tell you about investigates coherence of discourse of patients with a condition called semantic variant primary progressive aphasia, and I'm going to explain what it is in a minute. The second study is on coherence of discourse of AMCI patients, and that's amnestic mild cognitive impairment. And the third study is looking at the microlinguistic features of discourse. So we have 2 studies on macrolinguistic features and 1 study on microlinguistic features. Okay, so semantic variant primary progressive aphasia is a mouthful, and I'm going to refer to it as SVPPA from now on, and it's also known as semantic dementia. And this is a type of dementia which leads to atrophy in the frontal temporal parts of our brains. Language is primarily affected, not so much memory. And particularly naming and single word comprehension are impaired, while fluency and syntax are spared. So they're able to speak fluently, relatively fluently, and they are able to produce grammatically correct sentences, but they have difficulty naming particular specific objects. And if you tell them as one word in isolation, they may also have difficulty understanding it. Semantic memory is known to be impaired, while episodic memory, we're not quite so sure. So just so you can understand this better, basically, if you ask a person to report an autobiographical memory, they are able to. They can talk about their wedding day, the day their children were born. But as the disease progresses, they may have a difficulty identifying a bottle or a kettle or an umbrella. They will eventually not be able to recognize objects for what they are, not just name them. They really don't know what they are or what they're for. So it's a very particular type of dementia. When it comes to episodic memory in this group, there is some controversy in the sense that some scientists have found that these patients have better retrieval of recent events rather than more remote events, which is actually the opposite of what you see in Alzheimer's disease. However, other studies have found that both recent and remote memories were spared. And one study even went on to say that maybe their ability to not recall specific words is what is leading to this hypothesis that maybe they have episodic memory deficits, but that's not correct. And I want to, if you guys remember the brain images that I showed you earlier, you will notice that we have 3 colors here, but for this talk, we're only interested in the green one. This green area, excuse me, is the area which is atrophied in SVPPA. And it's also the area, you may recall, that is related to the semantic hub, which is believed to gather all the information that you need in order to form concepts. So it makes sense that that area being degraded will lead to semantic impairment. But we are focusing on discourse for this talk. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about that, about what has been said already in the literature. So coherence of discourse has been investigated in various populations, and it relates to the relatedness of items within a theme. So are you able to produce information related to the topic that you were initially talking about, or do you deviate from that topic? And are you able to maintain or to produce information that is both informative and relevant to your speaker? In healthy aging populations, differences have been found in the development of a coherence as individuals mature. So even from childhood to adulthood, from adulthood to older adulthood, some differences have been found. And in some populations with memory issues, which not necessarily relate to linguistic problems, coherence deficits have been found, such as in Alzheimer's disease and amnesic patients. If you are familiar with neurogenic conditions, you probably have heard of aphasia, which is a condition that people suffer from after having a stroke or after having a traumatic brain injury. If the stroke or the injury was in one of the areas related to language, like I showed you before, this may lead to this person not being able to produce speech or understand speech so much anymore. And in this population, coherence has been found to be impaired. And very similarly to the impairment that we have observed in dementia. However, dementia tends to suffer from more problems in producing discourse than aphasia does, at least from a macrolinguistic perspective. So the organization and the chronologic order. So my hypothesis here is that maybe this added memory problem that the dementia patients have just make it so much harder to organize the units to compose a coherent discourse. In SPP patients, indeed, it has been found that the patients have impaired coherence and also that they present with word-finding difficulties in discourse production. So this is what we thought. So we know that SBPPA patients have semantic memory impairment, and we know that they have linguistic problems and impaired coherence of discourse. So we hypothesized that maybe this impaired coherence of discourse would be observed when they were producing information related to semantic information, to semantic memory. And I'm going to give you an example that will hopefully make this clear in a minute. So this is the group that we have. We have 36 participants in this first study. 18 were SBPPA patients, 18 were healthy matched controls. They were asked to produce a discourse based on autobiographical recall of 2 memories. We transcribed and segmented these narrative into details. So basically, every sentence would be a different detail. So my dress was white, for example, would be one detail. Details were classified as episodic, semantic, or supplementary details as per a method called the autobiographical interview. These details were analyzed with a coherence rating scale, which we gave each detail a score from 0 to 3 based on how related to the topic they were, and then we calculated a weighted average to get to a final coherence score. So I did have a little audio for this, but again, because of the platform, we're not able to listen, so I'm just going to do a little dramatic reading of it. So the interviewer asked, okay, tell me about your wedding. And the participant responded, my wedding, it was a very small affair. My wife had arrived in Canada from Germany, I think in 1955 with her parents. She was a young girl, still going to school. So we were really struggling very much, both my wife's family as well as my own. So the wedding out of necessity was a very small one. When I look at the wedding that my children had, it was a far cry. It was just a very small group of family friends, and we were married in church, in a German Lutheran church down on College Street. And no big reception, as is so common these days. And then we all went home to my in-laws' place, and there was a part underneath there that is not showing, and he says that they celebrated in the in-laws' place in a very quiet fashion. So I have color-coded the information that this participant, and it's a much longer interview than that, but it's just a little piece so you guys can have a taste of the differences between the types of recall that we do while we are producing a narrative. So first of all, we have my wedding, and that's neither semantic information nor episodic information. This is what we call supplementary because it doesn't have information or relevance for the narrative. It has a pragmatic function. It's giving the speaker a chance to think about it, sort of reprocess what the interviewer just said, but it doesn't really add information to the speech. So that was considered supplementary information. It was a very small affair, was considered episodic information because it relates to the specific event of the wedding itself. My wife had arrived in Canada from Germany, I think in 1955. This is semantic information. Clearly, the speaker wasn't there at the moment that the wife arrived from Germany in 1955, right? So this is not a memory that he has of a specific time and place in which he was present. This is information that he knows of, but is not part of his imagery, of his personal experiences, as we say. So this is just to give you an example. So whatever is in green was considered semantic information. What's in red was considered episodic information. And throughout a narrative, all these 3 types of informations are recalled in an interconnected fashion. And it doesn't mean anything. The fact that you are producing semantic information as well as episodic information doesn't have any issues. The issue is when you are no longer able to recall one type of information, and in dementia, it's usually the episodic memory that goes first. And this is the coherence scale that we developed. So again, from 0 to 3, in which 0 is the detail that is devoid of semantic content. So a rhetorical question, a filler, repeating what the examiner just said. This received a score of 0. And 3 would be a detail that is very relevant for the frame that you're trying to tell. So the background story, the narrative that you're trying to develop. And I have some examples here. So the interviewer had asked, who was the best man at your wedding? And the participant responded, the best man would have been a friend of mine. That was considered a score of 3. Who I went to university with back in 1958, 1964, who now lives in Vancouver. So these are 2 details. Both were scored as 2. Actually, it lives up, not in Vancouver, but where's the Olympics going to be this winter? That's where he lives. So we can see that these details that were scored as 1, they really have nothing to do with the question that was asked. It's really not relevant for the story where the friend lives right now. They just asked who was it that was his best man, right? So this is how we calculated a final coherence score. And I'm so sorry, this didn't look like this earlier. But I'm going to describe to you. So basically what we found was that the SVPPA patients produced fewer episodic information. So remember I said that there was some question about whether or not they could recall episodic information. So based on this analysis alone, if we just count how much information they provided that was episodic, they produced fewer details. However, when we look at the amount of semantic details, and now I'm looking at the, this was animated earlier with just one graph showing at a time, but I'm going to try to describe this better. So the first graph that's on your left-hand side shows the number of details that the group produced. So if you look at the first set of columns, you can see the number of episodic details, and we can see that the SVPPA patients produced fewer episodic details. When we look at semantic details, we will see that there would be no difference between the number of semantic information that they produced and the controls. And the same for supplementary information. So if we were just to analyze the memory production like this, we would say this group has an episodic memory impairment, and that's it. But if we look at the analysis of coherence of discourse, we can see that the opposite pattern was found. So in spite of producing fewer episodic details, these details were coherent with the topic of discourse. However, when producing semantic information, even though they produced the same amount of information as the healthy participants did, this information was much less coherent. So that's good. That's what the hypothesis was. We thought that the memory impairment would be related to deficits in coherence of discourse, and that's what we found. But now we are left to try to understand why that is. So first, we thought that maybe when we think about episodic memory and we think about deficits in episodic memory, we think that reduced information is what shows an impairment. But this is not what we saw in this group. This group has a semantic impairment, and we were able to find deficits in their production when we looked at the quality of the details rather than the quantity. So this is something to think about. It may be possible that this was caused because having this semantic memory impairment, they had a difficulty setting the background for the story. But what we don't know after this study is, are the semantic memory deficits specifically related to impaired coherence of discourse? Or if we look at a group of patients who have a known episodic memory deficit, we would find different results, i.e., will they have deficits in coherence of episodic details? And this is how we moved on to do our second study on AMCI patients, or amnestic mild cognitive impairment. And very briefly, mild cognitive impairment, or MCI, is a condition in which a patient has cognitive decline, but with maintained functionality. So it's not as aggressive as dementia or not as advanced as dementia. And in amnestic mild cognitive impairment, or AMCI specifically, patients are known to have episodic memory primarily affected, while other cognitive functions are spared. In MCI patients, we have found some deficits in coherence of discourse. They have produced less thematic information, so less information related to the theme. So if they were telling the story of Cinderella, for example, they may forget to mention the crystal slipper or the fairy godmother. And they also present with word finding deficits, so difficulty naming things or finding the right words to describe a story. And at times, their discourse was said to be similar to controls, particularly related to the amount of macro propositions and cohesion, so the ability to maintain the sentences cohesively tied together. And at times, their discourse was similar to Alzheimer's disease, particularly related to the amount of irrelevant propositions that they produced. And this is a study that found the atrophy in the brain of amnestic mild cognitive impairment patients. And you can see that the impairment is not unlike the semantic dementia patients or the SBPPA patients. But if you look, remember where episodic memory is stored? It's in this inner medial temporal lobe. So that's where the atrophy in this group is more prevalent. So in the inner areas of the brain, while the first group had deficit in the outer areas of the temporal lobe. So when we compare the two groups, what we see is that SBPPA and AMCI patients have similar discourse production deficits. So they have word finding difficulties in both groups, and they have impaired maintenance of thematic information or impaired coherence of discourse. But they have the opposite pattern of memory deficits. So SBPPA patients has semantic deficits, and AMCI has episodic deficits. So, and these are both parts of autobiographical memory. So we were wondering how these different known deficits would affect the speech of these groups. So similarly to the first hypothesis that we have AMCI patients. We know they have an episodic memory impairment. So we wanted to test this time around if the impaired coherence of discourse would now be found in episodic information rather than semantic. For that, and this is actually, we're still collecting some data to have an even number of patients and controls, but we do have some preliminary results. We have 32 participants in these results that I'm going to show you guys. We have 14 AMCI, 18 matched controls. They also went through the autobiographical interview that we mentioned before. And this time around, their narrative was based on 5 memories. We recorded, transcribed, and segmented this analysis like we did the first time around. And again, the details were categorized as episodic, semantic, and supplementary. And the details were analyzed with the same coherence rating scale. And these are our findings. So again, if you look at the first graph on your left-hand side, you will see the number of details that each group provided. And we can see that, unsurprisingly, the AMCI group also produced fewer details. They actually produced a little bit more semantic details than controls, and a similar amount of supplementary details. Now, interestingly, when we look, and I'm sorry, the graphs are not very clear, but I will tell you, and I hope you trust me, is that when we look at the analysis of coherence of discourse in this group, oddly, we found the exact same pattern that we found in the semantic dementia patients. So when they produced episodic information, the information was coherent with the topic of discourse in spite of being less information. But when they produced semantic information, this information was also less coherent than the controls were producing. So in agreement with our hypothesis, we see that SBPPA and AMCI patients show deficits in coherence when compared to controls. The SBPPA patients were less coherent when producing semantic but not episodic information, so this we had predicted. What we hadn't predicted was that the MCI patients, who you may remember we said are not supposed to have any semantic memory issues, were also less coherent when producing semantic details. So that's interesting, but if we look at the data that we have and not consider the deficits that we knew they were known to have, we see that actually it sort of makes sense, because both groups presented with fewer episodic details and both groups presented with lower coherence of semantic information. So what we can take from that is that first, coherence of discourse is not linked to the primary memory deficit. And two, there seems to be a relationship between impaired episodic recall and semantic incoherence. So why that is, we can't tell for sure, but it's possible that difficulty recalling episodic details, so you can't remember well a detail, so that may lead to you producing more incoherent semantic information just because you're trying to recall that. So you're trying to get your brain warm up so that you can reach these specific details, but you can't. And then while you're talking, we have a social construct that requires that you tell a story, right? Like you're in an interview. Very few patients will just say, I can't remember. They will try to remember. And while they're trying, that's when we think that maybe the brain's firing up and reaching this irrelevant information that they're having difficulty inhibiting. But we don't know whether the chicken or the egg. So is it that difficulty recalling episodic details may lead to the production of more incoherent semantic details? Or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe because they have a difficulty setting this coherent frame in which the episode is happening, that may lead to the difficulty recalling the episodic items. So we can't guarantee for sure which deficit is causing it. But one question that was raised while we were doing this study was, is it possible that the deficits in coherence that we are observing are not so much a macro-linguistic difficulty like we predicted? Or could it be that maybe because they have these word finding issues that we know of, that may be causing them to have this impaired coherence? So because I cannot name the object that I'm trying to talk about, I end up talking about something else that was not related to the topic. So that's how we moved on to try our third study on microlinguistic measures of autobiographical memory. And in this study, we expect to do an analysis on both groups, but so far, I'm only going to present to you the first group, the SBPPA patients. So when we talk about microlinguistic impairments in this group, we know that they tend to produce fewer words than controls and fewer nouns particularly. And the syntax can be impoverished, but not agrammatical. So they may have difficulty producing more sophisticated sort of sentences like passive voice or dative, but they tend to be pretty syntactically okay. And we also know that their ability to recall specific words is related to some categories. So if a word is more familiar or more frequent, that tends to be easier for them to recall. So bottle, for example, would be easier than abacus, for example, but that's for everyone. And the age of acquisition, so the words that we acquire younger, they tend to be more resilient than other words. However, when we talk about imaginability, some scientists have found imaginability to actually make it more difficult for patients with SBPPA to be able to name things. So they're better naming abstract things like justice or love or friendship, rather than naming actual objects that are imageable. So that's the question that we had. So is it possible that we will find semantic impairment also related to this microlinguistic deficit? So when producing the narrative, we would also find like these word finding difficulties also in the set of semantic details. And if we do, does that mean that the lack of coherence that we observe in these patients is really just due because they have word finding difficulties and not something else? So this is the method that we use. This is called the quantitative production analysis. So basically what we do is we have the transcribed and segmented narratives, and then one by one we characterize each of these segments according to the microlinguistic features that they have. So how many words did they use in each segment? How was it grammatical? Was it not grammatical? Did they conjugate the verb correctly? How many open class words? How many nouns? How many verbs? It's a very extensive analysis, and then in the end we compare how much of everything each participant produced. Spontaneously, of course. So these are the results that we found when we look at the number of words that patients and controls produced. We see that there wasn't a difference in the total number of words. The patients produced fewer words actually when producing episodic information. There was virtually no difference between semantic words in patients and controls, and the patients actually produced a little bit more words when producing supplementary information. Similarly, in the bottom graph, if you ever guys see this little asterisk that sadly is out of place, that means that there was a significant difference between patients and controls. Sorry, I should have said that earlier. But yeah, so there wasn't a significant difference in total nouns. The patients produced fewer nouns when producing episodic information, no difference in semantic information, and they produced more nouns when producing supplementary information. I wish I could remove this, like this was supposed to be an animation, just so you guys could see the differences in the results that we found. So the patients also produced shorter sentences when producing episodic information, and the sentences were also less well formed when producing semantic information. So if I lost you guys at any point, this is the opposite pattern of what we had found so far. So initially we found deficits in macrolinguistic analysis of semantic information. Now we're finding a quantitative impairment in microlinguistic production of episodic details, while semantic details were not impaired at all. And the supplementary details were actually better for the patients than it was for controls. So we were left with a lot of questions after these results came out. So is the source of the impairment memory or language? Is it macrolinguistic or microlinguistic? And why do we find this differences in impairments in these different memory types? So the short answer is we don't know, but I have an idea that could potentially be right. So you will remember that I showed you in the beginning that little scheme about episodic memory and semantic memory, and episodic memory being this detailed, more sophisticated analysis, more sophisticated memory that holds specific information, while semantic memory has this more general, more diffuse nature that holds general knowledge. And we have the microlinguistic features, which hold specific names and specific structures, also more sophisticated than the macrolinguistic features, which are more organizational and more general than the microlinguistic features are. And we are seeing that in truthness, these systems seem to be impaired together. So for both types of dementias, in spite of what the known deficit was, semantic memory was impaired in macrolinguistic features, and episodic memory was impaired in microlinguistic features, so that we don't have the MCI results yet. And like I was saying, we have the differences in the familiarity of the words, the frequency of the words, and the imaginability of the words being relevant for the capacity of these patients to recall specific words. So it just may be possible that the words that we need to produce semantic information are different than the words that we need to produce episodic information. So it might just be more accessible for these patients who have this ability to recall abstract information more easily than they have to recall imageable information, the semantic memory just be more reliable for them. And maybe the words that we use to produce episodic information you may need more imaginability to be able to recall those. So it just might be, and the verdict still to come, that these patients, the deficits that we see in these patients, they are more related to their language deficits than they are to their memory deficits. If we look at the brain atrophy that we saw in the beginning, it definitely does make sense. Maybe if we can support the recall by supporting the type of words that these patients need, that might facilitate their memory recall. So this is something that we could test. And yeah, particularly related to the semantic features such as imaginability or frequency. In conclusion, this is what we learned then. So we have observed that semantic memory tends to be impaired when it relates to the ability to produce these macrostructures of discourse. However, it's spared in the microlinguistic structures of discourse. Episodic memory is the opposite, has the opposite pattern, which is spared macrostructure when producing episodic memory, but impaired microlinguistic structures when produced episodic memory. And interestingly, supplementary details, which tend to be more automated, are largely spared in both types of memory analysis. So for the future, we need to analyze the microlinguistic features of the AMCI group and see if that will help us come up with an answer as to why we observe these differences in deficits. We also will analyze the familiarity, frequency, and imaginability of the words in each type of memory and see if that solves our questions. And I think one thing that might help us understand this is if we analyze these strings of details. So maybe we can find that the patients, they are trying to produce episodic information, and that information sort of breaks down, so they don't finish the sentence or they use the wrong words. And the next sentence right after that may be an incoherent semantic information. So that would help us delimitate what the direction of the impairment is. So I just want to leave here a thank you to my supervisor, Dr. Elizabeth Rochon, and Dr. Kelly Murphy from Baycrest, who provided me with the data for the AMCI analyses, and my research committee, and my wonderful lab mates who helped me prepare this presentation. So thank you very much. To treatment? So the question was whether this information can contribute to treatment. It is my hope that it will. As I said, there are other studies that have been suggesting that the impairment that is believed to be a memory impairment in SVPPA patients is actually linguistic. So I think there's a great opportunity for us to advocate that patients with dementia need speech therapy, which is not quite as available as other types of treatment are. So I think that would be promising, at least on that direction. Also, these groups are often misdiagnosed as well. It's not an easy diagnose to find, like I showed you, like I mentioned in the beginning, when a patient looks for a doctor and says that they have a memory problem, they don't know what kind of problem really they have. They think it's memory, but it could be language, and often the doctor also doesn't know. So you need a speech pathologist really to be available to interpret the difficulties that these patients are saying they have, so that they can have a proper diagnosis. That's a good question. I wouldn't expect it based on my data. We did match the participants by gender, and in the literature there isn't really too much difference in the discourse of men and women. But I think it would be interesting to double check that, especially depending on the type of memory that is required, because many of the questions that we have are about, like your wedding day or the day your child was born, and particularly for older participants, often the man will say something like, "Well, I wasn't anywhere near my wife when we had our child," right? So the women tend to have this very vivid memory of the day their children were born, and the dad kind of just remember waiting around and going for a run, and or rushing to the hospital. So I think it would be interesting to check. Maybe not in quantity. I don't expect that the amount of information would be very relevant, but maybe the quality. Yes.
I'm formulating my questions. I know that I'm talking. I'm interested in people's social ability. If the discourse topic is part of a story that they told often,
Mm-hmm.
we're talking about children and the accumulation of vocabulary matching for when you hear about the narrate. I wondered if the same is true of the older adults, where the more I tell the story, the better I am.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's also a very interesting question. So the question was whether I think that the number of times that a story was repeated would influence their ability to recall it. So absolutely, yes. And that's also why there's a slight difference between the two groups when we did the autobiographical interview with them. In the first group, we just asked them specific questions about their wedding day and the day that their first child was born. But in reality, the autobiographical interview does not ask for specific questions like that, exactly for that same reason. So you have pictures of your wedding day, right? Like you have all of these external sources that will cue your memory to be better about that. But if you just ask a person, can you just tell me a memory from when you were a child? You allow for them to be telling you a story that maybe they don't tell quite as often. So that's the original method, and that's what we did with the AMCI patients. Sorry, long story short is I would expect to be a difference. But in the end, we did kind of find what we expected to find, which was even though we asked a specific question that they probably have told a million times before, they still showed the impairment. So, but it could have gone wrong, yes. Oh, yes. Okay. I did, at one point, I thought that a little chat box popped up in my screen.
Oh, it did?
Yeah, in the middle of the presentation, but I didn't stop talking.
Oh, maybe I was doing a chat. So this,
Oh, there you
I
go.
just want people to know that if you're online now and you're looking at the screen, that you'll see this purple X here, and when you click on it, it expands out your choices. And this little bubble is where you can actually go to chat, and then you type in this box. Just in case Monique or Julia have any questions at this time, I just wanted you to know where to go. We'll see if they. That was great. Thank you so very, very much. We have a small.
Oh, that's very kind. Thank you. It was my pleasure. I hope that was informative.
Very much so. And I noticed there's some extra people since the beginning, and I only told Bruna in the beginning, but I wanted to tell all of you that we want to foster interdisciplinary collaboration. So we're thinking of the speakers when they come to talk, maybe for an hour or two after the talk, we could book a room downstairs and have people that are doing research like Bruna, or even if they're not, come and talk about it in a little more detail, or have it as a writing intensive session for their thesis, or have it, or their papers, or have it as a networking social kind of occasion, or even a collaboration where you want to get together and do events together of whatever nature. So I just wanted to throw that out there to everybody. Let me know if you're interested and we'll set it up. And let me just check, see if anyone's said anything in the chat box. Not at the moment. So thank you everyone for attending, and we hope to see you at the next seminar. And thank you so much to Bruna for that fabulous talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much.